Hi everyone, welcome to this little bonus episode of Crash Course Catholicism. Today is pretty special because I'm going to be talking with my dad, who also happens to be an expert on the Shroud of Turin, which has had a kind of resurgence in interest and popularity in the last few years for reasons that I'm sure we'll get into in a moment. But just to kind of introduce you to people who don't know you, you've been a journalist for 50 years. And then in the last 6 years, you've been researching the Shroud. And after 6 years of research, you've written 2 books on the Shroud of Turin. So we're going to be going through some of the key kind of points about the Shroud, why it's genuine, why it's so important, what it reveals to us about our Lord. So I guess the first question for people who don't know anything about the Shroud of Turin is, what is it? What is the Shroud?
Yes, well, it's obviously the burial cloth of Jesus. And it's an absolutely extraordinary artefact. It's actually the most researched artefact in history. And the reason is that the evidence indicates that it actually has an image on it of Jesus at the point of the resurrection. Now this sounds ridiculous. You would think, well look, if something like that existed, everyone would know about it.
Yeah.
But of course, people don't know about it. And the reason is, or the main reason is, that there was a carbon dating test of it in 1988. And the carbon daters claimed that it was from the Middle Ages, that it was a forgery. In fact, that's been shown now to be absolutely not true. It's actually from the 1st century.
Wow.
It's 2,000 years old. And it has an impossible image on it. And because it's impossible, it's obviously a miracle.
Yeah.
No human being could have created that image. The cloth is covered with the blood from the wounds of Jesus. And it's become known as the silent witness because it tells us things that no artist had ever thought of at all. Anyway, we can get into all of that.
I've got like 6 questions in my head after that. Okay. Yes. But that's what got you interested in it, right? That I remember you saying that that you were a skeptic. You didn't believe that it was the genuine Shroud because of the carbon dating.
Well, it was a bit up and down. The first I heard of it was an old priest that I knew when I was growing up. He said, you want to go and have a look at this documentary. And it was actually in the cinemas in those days. And it was called The Silent Witness. And so I went along and had a look at it, and it was fascinating. I thought, well, you know, this really does look like the real thing. But in those days, there was no internet. You couldn't just go online and check it out and everything. So it sort of faded to the back of my mind. But then it was 1988 that the carbon dating results came out, and they said that it was medieval forgery. So I just thought to myself, well, you know, it wasn't the real thing. That's that. And I was a very busy journalist, and I just sort of put it aside and kept on. It didn't affect my faith. I was a practicing Catholic, and, you know, my faith didn't hinge on the Shroud. So anyway, I just put it right in the background for decades. Didn't even think about it, you know. Like most ordinary people, I didn't know what carbon dating was. It just sounded very official and very scientific, and something that, you know, once something was carbon dated, you couldn't have doubts about it because you were a bit silly if you did. So, and then not so long ago, a few years ago, I went into a Catholic bookshop, and there was an image of the face of the Shroud, this sort of thing. So I looked at that, and I was a bit taken aback, and I thought, gosh, you know, they shouldn't be promoting that thing. You know, everyone knows it's carbon dating. We all know what carbon dating is. And the thing was, you know, nobody really knew what carbon dating was. So anyway, I thought I'd look into it. And I thought I'd write a book and explain to people why it's a bit silly having an image like that hanging in the bookshop. Exactly. And so I joined. I became a member of an American skeptical society that published a magazine, and I became a member because I could get into their database and read all of the articles that had been written by skeptics over the years. And it was interesting, but I was pretty underwhelmed. And in the end, I thought, this just doesn't seem to make sense.
Right.
So I started looking at the pro-shroud material, and that was absolutely fascinating. And bit by bit, I came to realise this thing is not a fake. It's definitely not a fake. And the thing was, most shroud researchers knew that the carbon dating was wrong because they knew all the evidence about it, and it was just...
It just couldn't be right.
Absolutely. Anyway, it all started from there, and I've done an awful lot of research now, and I'm glad I wrote the book.
Yeah. So I guess there are two things there. One is the evidence that the carbon dating is wrong, and the other is the evidence that the shroud is real.
Yes.
Those are the two things that are in my head. And I remember you saying, like, when we've talked about this a lot, but I remember you saying that all of the evidence for the authenticity of the shroud, what did you say, it was like a universe of information? Like there's so much evidence.
There's a shroud researcher who refers to it that way. It's a universe of information. So it's very hard for anyone to be on top of all of the information. You know? As you would expect, is something that's the most researched artefact in history.
Yeah. So I guess maybe that would be useful to go through some of the key points that point to the authenticity of the shroud, and then we can talk a little bit about, like, you know, with all this in mind, like what do we do with the carbon dating? So if you, which I guess this is what you've done. Can I show them the book?
Yeah, sure.
These are my dad's books. William West, sorry. Riddles of the Shroud, Questions Science Can't Answer. That's the first book, right?
That's right.
And then this new one, which you have just published, is The Shroud Rises as the Carbon Date is Buried. So that's more on the carbon dating and what kind of went wrong there. In the first book, what you've kind of done is distilled all of this universe of information down to the key and most compelling points that kind of point to the authenticity of the shroud.
Yes, look, the best thing about the shroud is that there's a ton of information, a whole mountain of evidence. But the negative thing is there's a ton of information. You know, people find it very hard. And so after a lot of research, I thought I can condense this into something that most people can grasp, even people who are not really into science. But then, of course, once you start writing about it, you're trying to establish your credentials with shroud researchers and particularly scientists. So I went into a lot of detail, and towards the end of the book, I actually listed 99 pieces of evidence that supported the authenticity of the shroud. And that was interesting, and nobody has ever really succeeded in knocking down any of that evidence. But it's a lot, you know. A lot of people not going to sit.
It's overwhelming.
That's right. So that's one reason I started the second book, to make it even simpler and more accessible, and also because of more information had come out about the carbon dating, and I wanted people to understand exactly why it was wrong. Stepping back a bit though, look, the first thing about the shroud, the reason that it became interesting to scientists is this. Right. Now, that is an image of the face on the shroud itself. Yeah. And as you can see, it's a bit blurry. It's like a kind of a smudge. In 1898, the then King of Italy decided to have a photo taken of it so that it could be, they had an exhibition happening, and so that it could be publicised. Right. And so he got a photographer to take the photo. And when the photographer was developing the photo, this is what he saw. And he said at the time, I almost dropped, because of a glass panel, I almost dropped it on the floor and smashed it. I was so shocked, because it went from this weird looking smudge to a high resolution photographic image. Yeah. Now, it's not a photograph, but it has many of the qualities of a photograph. And we'll look at the nature of it a little bit later. But that was a shock, and it went all around the world. It was publicised everywhere. Yeah. And skeptics,
because suddenly you can see the face, and you can see it in such detail.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it went all around the world, and skeptics, of course, said, "Oh, you know, this is ridiculous. So that photographer has just faked that up." Yeah. And there was a big debate that went on at the time, and the skeptics just said, look, science will work it out. You know, it's clearly not the real thing. And
because this is the negative, right? I don't know if you said that. This is the negative of the photograph.
Yeah, but the negative is actually a positive, which indicates that the original is actually a negative, a photographic negative. Now, this was just ridiculous because this was first became known in the West, in Western Europe, in the 13th century, hundreds and hundreds of years before photography was developed. And so everyone knew that this is just ridiculess. But
it can't be a photographic negative because there's no such thing as photographs.
You couldn't get it. Anyway, they buried it away, and because they didn't get it out very often in those days. And when they took it out again, there was a new king, and he wanted to have another photograph taken. And he got one of the best photographers in Europe to take the photo. And then and he also got it witnessed. From every point along the way, people were watching to see that.
Wow, to make sure it wasn't faked.
That's right. So there it was again. And it was even, the photography had improved over the years, and it was an even more high resolution photographic image.
Wow.
So then all skeptics would say, well, you know, science will still work it out. You know? And
there's an answer.
We're still waiting. You know, it's been 128 years, I think. And there it is. It's nobody. There's actually the fellow who directed the first documentary film on the Shroud, named David Rolfe. Yeah. He's made a bet that nobody can actually reproduce the Shroud. They can't replicate it. And he says if anyone succeeds, he'll gladly give them $1 million.
Wow.
Back in the days when most people knew that it was the real thing, or had a very good idea that it was the real thing, one of the basic thing that they knew is that it was actually some kind of photograph, one that couldn't be explained. And
just going to put it here so that it's...
Yes. Yeah. The thing about it is that science has shown that it couldn't have been made in the usual way by an artist. There's no paint, pigment, ink or dye on the cloth. And the other thing is the image itself is actually made from the very surface microfibers of the cloth. The depth of the image is only the depth of a single human hair. Wow. Now, if it had been any kind of artist materials, any fluid or even gas, it would have gone much deeper into the cloth. It would have soaked in much deeper. So it's to this day, it's very clear that it couldn't have been done by an artist. The only way that it's been achieved is by beaming a great burst of light, of radiation, ultraviolet radiation onto it. And they worked out that to actually reproduce the image on the cloth would take more electricity than we can actually produce today.
What?
Yeah.
So, okay, so you're saying that the image of the face and the body on the Shroud has been put there not by paint or by anything else, but by a burst of light, a burst of radiation.
That's right.
But it has stained the cloth or burnt the cloth, but only on the very, very, very top microfibers at the top of the cloth.
Exactly, yeah.
Wow.
Now, not only has that created a photographic negative image on the cloth, not just the face, the whole body is a photographic negative image. It's also 3D, three-dimensional. Now, that is extraordinary in itself. There's no picture in the world, no photograph that is 3D.
When you say it's 3D, what do you mean?
Yes, okay. Well, the way it's been made to be 3D is that the discoloration of the microfibers, the closer the part of the body to the cloth, the more dense
Wow.
are the discoloured microfibres. So along the nose, they're very dense.
Yeah.
And then as you move back towards the cheeks, it gets less dense, and the density follows the curve of the cheeks, so that they're actually curved going back into the face. The interesting thing about all of that is that the 3D nature of the image has enabled scientists to work with artists to create perfect statues of the body on the cloth.
Wow.
Now this fact about the shroud is that it also raises the question of how could you get the light under the cloth that was in touch with the body. Now the thing about the cloth is that the body had to be inside the cloth for all of the blood deposits to be transferred to the cloth. Now, as anyone knows who's ever had a Band-Aid on a wound, when blood soaks into cloth, it sticks hard. Now, it would have been very difficult to take the cloth itself off once the blood was set. If the blood was still liquid, it would have smeared when you took the cloth off.
Right.
If it was set hard, as we all know with the Band-Aid, the blood clots break up as you take it off. But the interesting thing about the shroud, all of the blood flows and the clots are perfectly formed. They haven't been damaged at all by removing it. Now, the question is, how did that burst of light emanate from the body to create the 3D image? Where did the light come from? And obviously there's no way of producing the light under the cloth. So, you know, it just underlines the miraculous nature of the whole thing.
The suggestion there, with both the blood clots and the image on the cloth, you're saying that the burst of light had to have come from the body itself.
Yes. That's right.
That was under the cloth, which is miraculous. Like, how does a burst of radiation that powerful come out of a human body that's dead under a cloth?
Yes.
But then also the blood clots, the fact that they're still perfectly formed, indicates that the cloth wasn't ripped off the body, but that the body disappeared from under the cloth, right?
Exactly. It just basically disappeared, as you say. And of course, the cloth then fell through onto itself.
Right.
And when the two apostles, St. Peter and John, arrived at the tomb on Easter Sunday morning and walked into that tomb, there was the collapsed cloth. And knowing what we know about the shroud, you realise why John says he looked at the cloth and he believed.
Right, because it was still perfectly formed. There had been a body that had obviously just disappeared from under it. It hadn't been unwrapped.
Yes, and obviously he would have had a look at it and he could see the blood and he could see the image, you know. And it was, you know, and this is the thing, that this is why they removed the cloth from the tomb. In those days, you didn't go around removing burial cloths from tombs.
No.
They were thought to be unclean. And that's why for many, many years, in fact, centuries, they didn't ever show it publicly. There's a theory that because there are images, there are paintings of it, that the cloth was folded over and only the face was showing.
Really?
It was framed in a wide frame. And so therefore... they didn't show it around. They kept it secret, and also they didn't want the authorities, the Romans or the Jewish authorities, to get their hands on it.
Right.
It had an amazing history in Eastern Europe. It went from the south right up to the north to Constantinople, and it was kept there for a couple of centuries as well, until unfortunately the Fourth Crusade invaded, and they took everything they could get their hands on, including the relics shroud. Like the shroud.
Wow!
And then the Pope at the time was so upset about it. He said that all of those relics had to be returned, but of course they didn't. And even though the Pope threatened to excommunicate anyone who didn't return them, they kept them hidden. And then it surfaced again in northern France in the mid 1300s, and it went on display then. And then it made its way over a couple of centuries to northern Italy, to Turin, and that's where it's been.
And that's where it
since.
kind of surfaced.
That's where it gets the name to the Shroud.
The Shroud of Turin.
Yes,
oh wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
So that whole narrative about where the shroud came from and how it ended up in Turin, that reminds me of like what you've told me about the kind of microscopic elements of the shroud that show that it's real, like the pollens and things.
Yes. Well, modern science has looked very deeply into the whole makeup of the shroud, and you could talk about this all day, but there are certain things that really stand out. One is the actual flower pollen that they found on the cloth, and they've worked out that there's a whole lot of pollen there from Jerusalem.
Yeah.
They're from plants that only grow in and around Jerusalem, and they flower in spring when our Lord was crucified. So that obviously is a huge point in favour of the shroud's authenticity. But in addition to that, there are a whole lot of other pollens that show a journey from Jerusalem through Eastern Europe, across to northern France, and then to northern Italy. So that's one of the amazing microscopic elements of the shroud. Another thing is the blood itself. Not only has that been shown to be real blood, but it actually has blood chemicals. There are 3 separate blood chemicals that are indicative of somebody who suffered extreme torture. It's an obvious point that authenticates the shroud. One last one, a third microscopic element is they've actually found microscopic traces of soil, of dirt, on the nose, on the knees, and on the feet, which they've discovered is actually limestone soil, and not just limestone soil. It's a very particular one that's particular to Jerusalem. Wow. And some of the world's leading experts have confirmed it does actually have the chemical fingerprint of Jerusalem soil.
Does that mean, so just putting it all together, what you said about the chemicals in the blood that show that this person had been tortured, so if you were going to fake it, you would have had to go and torture someone and then take their blood. Exactly. And then also the pollens, which show that it came from, the cloth itself came from Jerusalem and then moved to Turin. But not only did the cloth come from Jerusalem, but the human being, the man who was wrapped in the cloth, he was also not only tortured, but he also was in Jerusalem because it's on his nose, knees, and the soles of his feet.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, right. Another point that just came to my mind as you were talking about that, with the blood and the discoloration on the cloth, I remember you saying that the blood came before the discoloration. Is that right?
That's right. What they've done, they've removed the blood. They use enzymes to remove the blood from the microfibers, and underneath the microfibers are not discoloured. So the blood had to be there before the burst of light that created the image, which is an extraordinary thing.
Because if you were going to fake it as well, you would create the image first, and then you would put the blood on.
That's right.
And if you were going to do the blood first, which would be a weird thing to do, then it would be very difficult to place it exactly in all the right spots when there's no image there.
No artist would ever work that way.
Yeah.
But quite apart from that, no artist could recreate those blood flows and clots. All of the paintings, not only in the Middle Ages but throughout history that artists have done, forensic pathologists can look at them just at a glance and say that's not real. Really? That's an artist impression. But with the shroud, some of the world's leading forensic pathologists looked at it in great detail and could not fault a single blood clot or flow. Yeah, the whole thing was absolutely 100% authentic.
Accurate.
Yeah.
And not just the blood flows as well, but the hands, right?
Oh yes, no, that was the other thing. Among the things that the Shroud has taught us is that the nails had to get passed through the wrist. As you know, all artists used to always put the nails through the palms of the hands. But then, of course, when they did experiments to see if that could support the weight of a grown man, they found that it didn't work. They just slipped straight through.
Yeah.
They just rip open.
I hate to think how they found that out.
Yes, well, this is right.
Did someone crucify a bunch of people?
A French surgeon, Pierre Barbet, and he, in those days, this was way back after the Second World War, it was possible, unclaimed bodies, the hospital actually allowed him to do experimentation for all different reasons, medical reasons, on these unclaimed bodies. And one of the experiments he carried out was to see if the palms of the hand could support the weight of the body. Without
So
the grisly
gruesome.
details, they couldn't, but the wrist could. And that's where the nails are in the shroud. That just
They're through the wrist.
Yeah, just
and also his
yeah.
thumbs aren't visible, right?
That's right.
Which was, yeah.
Well, Barbet found that when you put a nail through there, it went through the median nerve, and that caused the thumbs to go into the palm.
Yeah.
And so on the shroud, you see that the hands, you just have the four fingers, no thumb.
Which was like in artist impressions at the time.
Yeah.
Like
the
paintings.
thumbs were sticking out.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so it would have been weird for like what kind of medical knowledge would, if you had forged it, you would have had to have that medical knowledge.
True.
Yeah. Okay, so just to recap on everything we've talked about, you said that the actual image is a photographic negative, which would have been impossible to create at the time, and that it's only when you take a photo of the shroud and then look at the negative that you see the full image, which, by the way, I really recommend just sitting and looking at the image because it's just amazing. It's so compelling.
Yes.
You can see that his face is all swollen and that he's been beaten and there's the blood on like around where the crown of thorns was, etc. It's an amazing image. So you've got the negative image. You've got the fact that the image on the cloth wasn't made by paint. It was made by a burst of radiation that was so fast but also so powerful that it's impossible to replicate. And that burst of radiation came from the body that was underneath the shroud.
That's right.
And then the body must have disappeared from under the shroud because the clots are still intact, the blood is still intact. The blood was there before the burst of light happened. It actually came from a human body that had been tortured, as we can tell from the chemical compounds in the blood. And also the person who had been tortured was from Jerusalem because he has Jerusalem soil. And then the cloth itself came from Jerusalem and then was taken through, what was it? Through
Eastern Europe. Across to France and then
ended in Turin, which is where it is now.
That's
so
right.
it's pretty compelling that it can't have been an artist because it's not been painted on.
No.
And also how the heck would you do that?
That's
it
right.
can't have been a forger who, like, it's just inconceivable. Someone went and tortured someone, and even if they had tortured and killed someone in order to create this image, how would they create the burst of light, the radiation?
Exactly.
So it's just so like how else could this possibly have been created?
Yes.
So then with all of that in mind, it's super compelling, but then you look at the carbon date and the carbon date said, no, this cloth was made in the medieval period, right? Mm-hmm. That's what they came up with.
Yes.
So what do you do with that, with those two conflicting?
Well, look, the problem with the carbon dating is that there was never any real evidence produced at the time. As a journalist, I was pretty shocked by the way it was all handled. What happened was they reached certain views about the date, and then someone, or more than one person, there were several leaks to the media. Now, once that was leaked to the media, they had to have a rushed press conference. Well, they actually had two, one in Italy and one in London. It was the one in London that got most of the press coverage. Now, because they hadn't published any data, all they had to show for themselves was an old blackboard with two dates chalked onto it. It was 1260 to 1390, exclamation mark.
So they just wrote that up on a chalkboard and then displayed it to the world.
That's right.
These are the dates.
And then one of the head carbon daters, a fellow named Teddy Hall, Professor Edward Hall from Oxford University, Teddy Hall. The three men who conducted the carbon dating press conference were all self-confessed atheists. They had no time for religion. But Teddy Hall was particularly aggressive in the things that he said. And he said, these are the words that he used, there was a multi-million-pound business in making forgeries during the 14th century. Someone just got a bit of linen, faked it up and flogged it. Now there was absolutely he had no evidence at all that someone had faked it up and flogged it, but he just put it out there.
Because that was the date they'd found, so that must be what had happened.
Exactly. And so for, as I say, for decades, for 28 years, that was the view that prevailed. Now, throughout all of this, 4 months after the press conference, they published the first data in an academic journal called Nature Journal.
And to be clear, normally the process would be, if you were conducting scientific research like this, you would conduct your research, you would publish your data, it would be peer reviewed, it would appear in an academic journal, and then you would get up and give a press conference and say, this has been confirmed, this has been peer reviewed, this is what we found. Exactly. But their data was leaked, or the findings were leaked to the press before any of that happened, so they just got up and said it before any of it had been verified or peer reviewed or anything.
Absolutely. And so then after that, when Nature Journal published the most basic data, even then the other Shroud researchers could see that there were problems with that data, that the figures didn't add up. I won't go into that now. I've gone into it.
It's in the book. It's fascinating. Depth.
But it was very clear once what happened then. The other Shroud researchers said, well, we'd like to see the data.
And raw data.
Yeah, in the academic world, I've reported on the academic world for many years, that would be no problem. People would produce their data, and then it would all be discussed and debated and all the rest. But in this case, they said no.
Really?
You can't have it.
Really?
Basically, and they kept it hidden away or locked away for 28 years until somebody launched a legal action under Freedom of Information laws in Britain asking for the data. But then, of course, the carbon daters couldn't withhold it any longer, so they handed it over, and it's now very clear that there were huge flaws in the data.
Wow.
And,
So what they published in Nature Journal was their interpreted kind of conclusions.
Well, this is it. You see, most people think that, I used to think this way, that the carbon dating, that they had a scientific instrument that measured the carbon-14 in something that used to be a living thing.
Yeah.
And with carbon dating, it relies on the fact that once a living thing dies, the amount of carbon-14 in it decays at a known rate, and they can work out by measuring it how old the thing is. So they did that. They carried out their tests, but what they don't, what ordinary people don't pick up from all of this is that once the measurements are made, they have to do all of these statistical analyses to make sure that the data is reliable. Now that's where the problem is. The analysis that's been done over and over again now shows that it wasn't reliable at all.
Wow.
In fact, there's there's only one chance in 100 that those figures were reliable.
And yet it was just published, and then the whole world
and it was given out as something was absolutely certain. There was no mention of statistical analysis, none of that. It was just two dates on a blackboard.
Wow.
And smile at the camera. And smile and wave, boys. You know, it was like, no, it's true.
Yeah.
It's just amazing.
Yeah, it was when I was reading what you've written. It's like a detective story. It's so interesting reading how they went about it and what were the problems, and then how it all came out. But it's such a like as someone who's been in that academic environment for the last few years, it's just a fascinating case study of how academic research can be done poorly, and what happens when you don't do your due diligence and you cut corners, and it's amazing.
Well, some people argue that it was some kind of conspiracy that they set out to achieve the result that they wanted, partly to promote their own carbon dating technique. It was called a small sample carbon dating. It used to be that you had to have a sample the size of a handkerchief, but they could do it with a little 4 centimetre bit. And so they were really anxious to promote their new technology. To show
that it was reliable.
Now, when I was a young journalist, an editor advised me, he said, look, if it's a choice between a conspiracy and a stuff-up, always go for the stuff-up. Yeah. Now, these days a lot of people want to, say it was a conspiracy. That's not necessarily my view. I have an open mind about the whole thing. The one thing that's absolutely certain, though, is that it was flawed. The carbon dating was flawed. Yeah. The dates were wrong. Yeah. And as there have been other dating techniques used now to date the Shroud, and they all date to around 2,000 years. The first century, definitely.
Really?
Yes, absolutely.
Wow.
That and all of the historical information and all of the scientific information that confirms its authenticity, all of these things come together, and it's just beyond doubt.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And then when you when you put it all together, it's so compelling. It seems, I mean, having read both of your books, I'm so convinced that it's the authentic Shroud. And then I guess the question is, why? Why would God allow that? Why would he give us this artifact? What does it show us? What is its importance to us in the 21st century?
Well, I've discussed this with God at length. Look, my best guess is that there's an expression in God's good time. Yeah. And God has his own reasons for revealing things at certain times. For me, the most important thing is that how privileged we are to know this now, because back in the Middle Ages, or even in the 19th century, science wasn't developed enough to reveal the things that have been revealed now. So we're just very lucky to get the full picture now. Yeah. And the world's not in a good state at the moment. Yeah. And I just wonder if God thinks that we all need a bit of help to support our faith these days, and that's why it's happening now. It certainly does support people. So there have been very many atheists who've been actually converted by the Shroud. Wow. People who were really, rabid, Richard Dawkins characters.
I thought you were going to say Richard Dawkins was converted by the Shroud. There's a headline.
Well, he should be. If he takes any notice of it, he should be. But no, it's a really important thing today to know about it. Of course, the church doesn't say that we all have to believe in it. But my impression is that, if you know all the evidence, you'd be a bit of a deal not to believe it. But and it's not an article of faith.
No. But it is worth looking at and spending time with, because I know you've talked to me before about how much it helps just in your prayer and in getting to know God better and really appreciating the sufferings that he went through in his death, in his crucifixion. And,
absolutely. Yeah. And particularly those wounds through the wrist. They say that that's the most excruciating pain you could have, to have a nail pass through your median nerves, because that's where all the nerves that supply the hands, and you know how sensitive to touch hands are, all the nerves pass through that point. And they say it's just absolutely excruciating. No wonder one of the thieves was just screaming at our Lord to do something. Yeah. It's just extraordinary. And the whole time, his body was rigid, trying to push up to gulp in air, to push out air and gulp air in over and over and over again for 18,000 seconds. He was there going through that excruciating pain. And because, as the Shroud shows, he was scourged on the chest, as well as all the other parts of the body, but particularly on the chest, fluid was building up in his chest the whole time, which made it very difficult to breathe. And that's why when the spear went through his lung and into the heart, it wasn't only blood that came out, but clear fluid that looked like water, but it was just blood serum.
Yeah.
And it's just extraordinary.
Yeah.
Extraordinary pain, unbelievable pain. You just can't imagine it.
And the scourging marks are all over the body, the front and the back as well.
That's right. All over the shoulders, the arms, the legs.
Yeah.
Everywhere. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Well, okay. So for anyone else who wants to know more about any of this, I really recommend, and not just because he's my dad, but because these are amazing, these 2 books, The Shroud Rises as the Carbon Date is Buried, and Riddles of the Shroud, Questions Science Can't Answer. So both of those are available on Amazon, right?
That's right.
Amazon, US, UK, AU, depending on where you are.
Yes.
You can order them there, and they're pretty ripping reads, really fascinating. Thank you, Dad. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Caitlin.
Yes. It's fascinating, and I'm sure the listeners will really enjoy learning about the Shroud as well.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah.